If you're anything like me, when you heard historic suspension announcement, you must have thought to yourself, wait, are they getting rid of the historic format already? They just released a bunch of new cards for it. What's going on? Greetings, owners of fine luxury cardboard rectangles. Today we are here to discuss the brand new concept in terms of bannings, because that's what we're dealing with. The historic suspension announcement is actually announcing what cards are suspended in the historic format, while also explaining what exactly being suspended means. So what I'm going to do is up on the screen, I'm going to put the 4 cards that are going to get suspended. Now, before I put them up, take a wild guess. Just go ahead, picture in your head, or type in the comments below, however you want to do it, what your 4 guesses of the cards that would be suspended in historic are. And yeah, you can go ahead and use a cheat sheet from previous ban announcements in the recent past if you want to as well. All right, ready? Got your guesses locked and loaded? Well, up on the screen, you will see the answer and you will know if you have nailed it or not. So what I want to do is I want to go through this suspension announcement. I'm going to leave these images of the cards up here on the screen while we talk about what's going down, all right? So this historic ranked period is about a month old, and we've been eagerly looking over the feedback and data we're gathering on the new format. We're generally happy with what we're seeing there, with good play rates and a fairly healthy looking metagame balance. Only a couple of decks are more than 5% of the meta, and for the most part, win rates are showing a good, healthy spread. There are a couple of outliers here, though, that we will be addressing. We're happy with how the cards in Historic Anthology 1 have been adopted, where several have found roles in key decks, and the additions have enabled some fun new archetypes. We're seeing the new cards appearing in over 20% of the decks used in high-level historic play, which is a good sign we've landed about where we wanted to be. Good, useful options, but not something that has warped the format around it. Burning Tree Emissary has proved the most popular of the new cards, showing up in both Gruul and Jund shells. The Soul Sister archetype has also proven popular, using Soul Warden and Serra Ascendant to complement a mono-white life gain package. I actually remember talking about that. I did a video reviewing all of the new historic cards. I'll actually throw that as one of the links at the end of the video if you want to watch me go through the different historic cards and talk about the flavor and all that goodness. If you are curious, you will be able to access that afterwards. Now, overall play in historic is tracking slightly lower than we'd like to see, which largely seems to be coming from players preferring to play best of 1 over best of 3. Somewhat surprisingly, we saw about 3 times the rate of games played in the historic launch event, best of 1, than we do in the historic ranked queue, best of 3. This suggests that while best of 3 is the most competitive way to play, the majority of our players still prefer best of 1. And this holds even in the historic format, which we expected to attract more competitive-minded players. With this in mind, we're looking at expanding the importance of best of 1 play in future ranked historic periods. Now, I'm definitely one of those people who falls into the category of I enjoy best of 1 far more than best of 3, so I'm totally cool with that, man. If I'm going to sit down and play historic with some old cards, I'm happy to have it in a best of 1 style. So it moves on to the next part of the article. Cards we are suspending in historic. Getting back to those outliers in win rate and diversity, there are a few cards we've identified as being problematic in the historic meta, and we'll be taking action to address those. None of the cards we're acting on here will come as a surprise. And this is where, obviously, your guesses played out or they didn't. I mean, you saw the cards a little bit earlier in the video, but whatever, we can pretend like this is actually answer time. Once upon a time, we're seeing much the same thing in historic that we saw in Standard and Pioneer. Once upon a time is very prevalent in any top decks playing green, and it's leading to green in general being overrepresented in the meta. Suspending it, more on what suspending means below, should help bring greater deck diversity. Next up, Field of the Dead. Similar to Once Upon a Time, Field of the Dead is constraining historic in much the same way it affected Pioneer. It's having too large of a damping effect on controlling and reactive deck options. Suspending this should allow a wider variety of deck archetypes to be viable in historic. The third suspended card is Veil of Summer. Much as we saw in Standard and Pioneer, Veil of Summer's high efficiency is proving stifling to the overall metagame by neutralizing too many counterplay options. Suspending this card should bring more diversity to the answers and decks performing well in Historic. And the final card that got suspended, and no one will have seen this coming. Oh, look, it's Oko. Big surprise there. So, Oko, Thief of Crowns. We wanted to give Oko a chance in Historic, but the data is showing similar, though less severe issues to what we saw in Standard. He's not nearly as prevalent in the meta, only around 15% of the decks, but several of these decks are seeing win rates in excess of 55% in high-level play. This suggests that meta share could quickly grow, so we're suspending Oko now to prevent that. Seems like a smart move, in all honesty. None of this suspended stuff is in any way a surprise. It makes perfect sense. These cards were already causing a problem, and they're cropping up in Historic as well. The article continues. The Historic card pool is currently somewhere between Standard and Pioneer with a few quirks of its own. Over time, those differences will increase, but for now it makes sense that cards having shown themselves to be problematic in those formats would also be problematic in Historic. Unlike Standard and Pioneer, Historic is a digital format. This means we have additional options for how we address these cards, and instead of banning them outright, we're using a new mechanism called suspension. This part here says what suspension means. Historic is evolving rapidly, both from general play and because it's receiving new cards fairly regularly. To support it properly, we need a way to control the balance that works well with Magic's history of using bans and restrictions while allowing more flexibility to adjust as Historic changes. Suspending cards gives us that mechanism. For gameplay purposes, a suspension works like a ban in that the card will not be legal to use in the format while it is suspended. But unlike how we handle banning cards, we plan to use the flexibility that the digital format provides to move cards onto and off of the suspension list more commonly. The off of portion there is important. Suspension isn't a final verdict. It's an indication that we think this card may be causing issues, and we'd like to see what the meta looks like without that influence. Suspension is also a temporary measure. All the cards we're suspending here will be removed from the suspension list by or before the ranked Historic queue returning in March. Some may be returned to the playable pool, likely because we believe the new environment provides the appropriate answers or countermeasures, and the rest will move to be fully banned. Now, how suspensions will be issued. We're actively monitoring the card and deck stats in Historic and regularly evaluating whether we feel like there are issues that need addressing. For this first Historic period, we're tending to keep a light touch, reacting less, and seeing how things develop naturally. But in the future, we're likely to move cards on and off the suspension list more frequently. In a format like Historic, it's always our preference to provide answers to a problematic card rather than ban it. And that's one of the roles the future Historic anthologies will be serving. In some cases, a combination of new answers and an evolving meta will let us remove cards from the suspension list, but where we feel like that's not happening, or at least won't happen for a while, we will move cards from suspended to fully banned. When cards are fully banned in Historic, you will receive wildcard reimbursement as normal, with the caveat that you won't receive multiple reimbursements for the same individual card. For example, a player has collected 2 copies of card X when it's banned in Standard, and they receive 2 wildcards at that time. Later, the card's also banned in Historic. Though they still have 2 copies, they won't receive additional wildcards because they've already been reimbursed for the copies they have. However, if they had crafted or otherwise collected more copies between the Standard banning and the Historic ban, they would receive reimbursement for those new copies after the Historic ban. So it's pretty straightforward. Basically what it's saying is take a scenario like where Oko gets banned, right? So Oko gets banned in Standard. If you had 2 Okos when he got banned in Standard, you were given 2 Mythic Rare wildcards as your reimbursement. Now, if they go ahead and ban him again in Historic, and you still only have 2 copies, well, you already got your wildcards back for those 2 copies of Oko when he got banned in Standard. But if you had either crafted with wildcards or opened 2 more Okos, bringing your total of Okos to 4, then when it got banned in Historic, you would get 2 more wildcards. So those would only be the ones that you had gotten after the Standard ban had come into effect. That's basically how they're doing it, and that makes perfect sense. Not giving you multiple copies back for particular cards makes sense. The future of Historic is how this article is ending off. We feel like Historic is in a healthy place and developing well, and these suspensions should help it continue to grow in diverse and interesting directions. To help that along, we have several upcoming historic events and more on the horizon. We'll be running our first historic ranked draft with Dominaria from January 3rd to 16th, where you can help complete your Dominaria collection or just enjoy one of Magic's all-time top draft formats. We'll also be capping off this historic ranked period with a high-stakes constructed tournament for January 11th to 13th. So bring your best deck and compete for a top prize of 40 historic packs and more. If you're wondering what that means by historic packs, that just means any booster packs that are currently available on Arena but aren't in Standard. So Ixalan, Rivals of Ixalan, Dominaria, Core 2019, that kind of stuff. That's what they mean. The regular historic constructed events will begin on January 16 as Theros Beyond Death releases and ranked historic moves to the off-season while the focus shifts to Standard. Then in March, we plan to release Historic Anthology 2 and Ranked Historic will return. We've got a lot more planned for Historic later in the year, and we're actively working with the Tabletop Studio R&D to design the remaster sets we talked about last update. To answer one question we see a lot about these sets, they're being designed to support both constructed and limited play, but we'll talk more about that as things get closer. So, that covers everything that the article has to say in regards to what's going on with these suspensions. I think it's a pretty good concept, honestly. It allows them to move in on things that are problematic more quickly if they're really just like snap suspend. They didn't say anything about how frequently they would do suspension announcements. The idea that the cards could come back if the meta has shifted enough by the time the suspension period ends is also interesting. I like the idea of being reactive. It's unfortunate this concept can't really be applied to Standard because Standard Paper and Paper Standard Magic and Arena Standard Magic need to be in synchronicity, essentially. Any deviation from that can get kind of confusing. We saw that with the foil Nexus of Fate. I don't know why I said foil on Arena. It's not really foil, is it? But either way, Nexus of Fate was banned in one, but not banned in the other. And that leads to a little bit of confusion where it's like only best of one. Is it best of three? Is it Arena only banned? So keeping Standard in just basically the same across the board is the best thing to do. But I definitely do like this concept of suspensions. I think it's a decent way to attempt to work around the problems of cards that become an issue while also taking advantage of the fact that it's a purely digital format. So you have more control over how to finesse and shape it. Now, I'm interested to know what you guys think about all this. Is this something that matters to you? Do you feel like there's any real difference from a banning? Let me know in the comments below. I'm going to leave some videos here at the end of the video based on stuff that I do on this channel and on my other channel where we're just messing around, having a good time. So thanks everybody for coming on by. Big shout out to my patrons and channel members for helping me out. And remember, my friends, together we are the sixth color of magic.